Welcome, everyone, to today's presentation on supporting refugee youth and their families in schools. Today's presentation is put on by the Refugee One Wellness Program. Our focus today is adolescents, ages 11 and up. So our agenda for today, we're first going to focus on some basic definitions, what to know, current trends, then we'll shift to cultural humility, trauma in adolescence and how that can be viewed in the classroom setting, challenges and strengths of refugee youth and families, communication strategies, creating a welcoming classroom environment, resources and tips for all staff members, and then we'll summarize with some final takeaways. So first, I want us to cover some basic definitions. An individual's immigration status will impact the kinds of benefits they will receive on a federal, state, and local level. A migrant is a generic term for anyone moving to another country with the intention to stay for a minimum period of time. This includes both permanent and temporary migrants with a valid permit or visa, asylum seekers, and undocumented immigrants who do not belong to any of the three mentioned groups. This is an umbrella term. Within the migrant umbrella, you have asylum seekers, who are individuals who have formally submitted a request for asylum, but have not yet completed the asylum procedure or is still pending. If individuals are denied asylum, their status changes to undocumented migrant. A refugee refers to persons who have completed the asylum procedure with a positive outcome and have been granted protection by obtaining refugee status. So why are these definitions important? And here, language really matters. As previously stated, a person's status will impact the kinds of benefits they will receive. Refugee status provides a direct pathway to citizenship, and individuals cannot be deported. They receive financial benefits, medical assistance, employment services, and housing services, and at times mental health services. Asylum seekers are not guaranteed a direct pathway to citizenship, and they do face the risk of deportation. Asylum seekers have potential to receive some federal and state benefits while their case is pending, but typically they don't have access to all federal benefits that refugees have access to. The kinds of services provided to individuals based on their status is very nuanced. Another category we're going to be talking about today is humanitarian parolee. This humanitarian parolee status does get quite murky. It used to be very small, and now it's greatly increased in the populations it serves. There are pretty stark differences between these statuses. The tables just show that these things are generally known to be true, but more and more exceptions keep getting added and treated in their own new category. It is quite difficult to generalize the experiences of refugees from different countries, since their experiences can vary greatly. Some refugees arrive in the United States from their home country. Others live in refugee camps in nearby countries for years before being granted refugee status in the United States. Many don't realize that the average time spent in a refugee camp is 17 years. This means that for some children and adolescents, a refugee camp is the only life they have ever known. This is due to the fact that the immigration process is very long and tedious. Refugee camp conditions are poor, and educational resources are slim to none. For asylum seekers, the journey to the United States can be extremely dangerous and filled with a lot of uncertainty. For migrants in general, simply hearing about news from back home can be triggering and can activate traumatic symptoms. So the United States welcomes hundreds of thousands of refugees through the U.S. State Department Refugee Admissions Program. Having fled violence, persecution, and war, vulnerable refugees from around the world come to the U.S. to rebuild their lives. Resettlement is a long and often difficult process, as we've stated before. Not all resettlement agencies are the same, but typically, most resettlement agencies will provide housing services, English language training, and workforce development. In addition, there are some agencies that also provide mental health services, youth programming, immigration services, and some that provide cultural orientation about how to adjust to life in the United States. At this time, refugee arrivals are coming from Burma, Congo, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, Sudan, and South Sudan. The number of arrivals in the US changes quickly based on current events and the current administration's views on immigration. At this time, the US is not seeing a lot of refugee arrivals, mainly humanitarian parolees coming from Afghanistan and Ukraine. So we're first going to focus on the current trends, meaning the Afghan humanitarian parolees. In May of 2021, the Taliban took over the capital of Afghanistan, and the US established Operation Allies Welcome, a short-term immediate response for Afghan citizens. US citizens, interpreters, and embassy staff were the first to be evacuated from the country. The process was unplanned and frankly extremely hectic, leaving hundreds of Afghans to chase down and cling on to moving planes. Many families were separated in this process. The US granted Afghan refugees temporary humanitarian parolee status, with application fees and fear interviews that were required. The experience for many refugees from Afghanistan was in itself a very traumatic experience, let alone all that they saw while they were in their home country. Next, we'll focus on the Ukrainian humanitarian parolees. So when the war in Ukraine erupted in February of 2022, the US established Uniting for Ukraine, a streamlined long-term program that welcomed Ukrainians and offered them humanitarian parolee status if they had a sponsor in the United States. They would live with their sponsor, and their sponsor would be a financial assistance for them. The status was renewable, the application fee was waived, and no fear interview was required. Even in Chicago, there were rallies of support, and large financial donations went to the service of Ukrainian parolees. In the US, in 2022 alone, over 1,600 Ukrainians boarded planes and came to the United States. Before arriving in the US, many individuals lived in dangerous and inhumane conditions. Families were separated in the process, as many chose to stay and fight against the invasion. Once in the US, Ukrainians must apply for asylum status and wait for approval. Many asylum seekers at Refugee One are coming from Haiti, Venezuela, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Asylum seekers have the least access to services by federal regulations. Luckily, there are many local organizations in Chicago that work to provide services for asylum seekers. But at Refugee One, unfortunately, asylum seekers do not have the same access to services as refugees or humanitarian parolees from Afghanistan or from Ukraine. Another current trend to be aware of is the journey for some migrants from South and Central America. Thousands of migrants, primarily Haitian and Venezuelan, are crossing what's called the Darien Gap, which is located between South and Central America, to reach the United States. Consisting of watershed, forest, and mountains, the Darien Gap is considered to be one of the world's most dangerous jungles, and migrants make the 65-mile trek by foot. Rape and robbery are common, and there are numerous fatalities along the way. Upon arrival to the border, migrants will stay in refugee camps for an indefinite amount of time. Migrants are often up against systemic barriers by states unwilling to take them in and are treated with inhumane disregard. Now, whether you are watching this video in a group or on your own, I want to take some time for reflection. I encourage you to pause this video after each question and allow for thoughtful reflection and discussion before moving forward. What similarities or differences do you notice in the refugee experiences? How did the responses from the US differ? How might the varying refugee experiences affect a child's overall ability to transition to life in the United States? Now we're going to shift and discuss cultural humility, how that relates to trauma and the experiences of refugee youth, and the ways that trauma can become noticeable in the classroom. The video that we are about to see here is from the perspective of professors and students at a university. However, it's very applicable to any age group, especially adolescents and middle school and high schoolers.
With cultural humility, the goal is to lower your own sense of self-importance, to be open to receive other people and other people's way of life, to be present, to be listening, to be open, to see.
We are all equals and we each have skills to share. You're talking about developing a partnership. I have something to give and you have something to give. And what are we going to create from that? It's not coming in as if you have all the answers because you're at the university. And I have none of the answers because I am from a minority community. You have to be relaxed, you have to be humble, you have to come not to a lower level, but to a level that people can understand what you're saying, can understand that you want to be there. Body language is such a big thing. If you're not comfortable, then you need to go into a community with people that are comfortable so you can see how they act, what type of clothes they wear, how they speak to people.
Whether you're a professor, or whether you're a student or a staff person or whatever your station is, there may be this kind of sense, within our egos that we need to approach communities that we're working with a sense of knowing everything, of being the teacher. And in cultural humility, it's okay to not know, and it's okay to ask a question. It doesn't mean that you're not intelligent. It just means that you may not know something. So I think it's just important to approach folks who may have different social identities in that way, with a sense of openness, with a sense of listening and really seeing, listening to understand instead of listening to talk and teach, and occupying the space of being a true learner. I think that's important.
Please remember that we are all equals and we each have skills to share. So even though we may not have all of the book knowledge that a university student has, we still have a lot of knowledge and skills, and we're still moving forward. And we need assistance with moving forward. And there's probably a lot the university students could learn from us too.
So, what is cultural humility? It's a personal, lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of his or her own beliefs and cultural identities. This requires ongoing reflection about one's own biases. As teachers, people often say, you are lifelong learners, and that's exactly what cultural humility is about as well. There's also this recognition of power dynamics and imbalances in the systems in the United States, as well as a desire to address those power imbalances, not ignore them, and to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. There's an openness in cultural humility, and a lot of empathy and compassion is required as well. I do want to note that there is a fine balance between educating yourself and assuming that you will never know everything. So as the video touched on, it is okay to ask questions, to ask students questions about their culture, about their families, but also you don't want to ask something that could be offensive. So do your research before you have those conversations with students. So how can conversations around power imbalances show up in the classroom? Given our unique life experiences, certain subjects or topics may impact individuals differently. I really ask that you don't shy away from explicitly addressing the inequities you see in the classroom or outside of the classroom with students. If you're experiencing discomfort during these conversations, students are probably experiencing it too. And it's okay to have an open dialogue about that. Having an adult facilitate that open dialogue in a safe classroom environment is better than avoiding such conversations. As a former CPS teacher myself, I know that more often than not, students are aware of, have experiences with, and/or want to talk about these issues. So continue your research and seek out materials that are developmentally appropriate for your students. This image is called the cultural iceberg. Before we address it, just want to read out a quote by Freya Starr. She stated, "The portions we see of human beings is very small. Their forms and faces, voices and words. But beyond these, like an immense dark continent, lies all that has made them." Looking at the graphic, we see that there are tangible, more surface level ideas about culture, then a much deeper understanding of cultural values that many may not be so easily seen or understood. On the surface, cultures are made up of unique foods, festivals, music, dance, languages, and performances. But below the surface is what we call deep culture. Communication styles and rules will look different for different cultures. Notions of friendship, leadership, and courtesy will look different. Concepts of time, self, fairness, and justice, attitudes towards elders, adolescents, authority, expectations, and topics like death and work are important to understand about one's culture. Each culture and family will be different in their approach to their faith, marriage, decision-making, and problem-solving. As a classroom teacher or staff employee, it's important to be aware of and understand these unique aspects of one culture before interacting with the student or their family. Having cultural humility truly means just being teachable. If you think you have it down, it's likely that you do not. Having cultural humility means learning from your students and trusted colleagues. It would be false to say that we don't have our own biases. We all have biases. And part of cultural humility is being able to name and reflect on your own biases and understand the impact of systems and their effect on individuals that may come from a different background. And this really plays into trauma that we'll see in adolescence. So the best thing we can do is to remain patient and empathetic. For many adolescents who have experienced trauma, they may not present symptoms until they've settled into a safe environment. I won't read out all of them, but some symptoms of trauma look like misbehavior, like disrupting other students and the classroom environment, angry outbursts or physical outbursts, engaging in illegal, rebellious, or high-risk activities. They may have a lack of impulse control. Students may have a distrust of authority figures and escalated reaction to triggers. So think about loud noises, alarms, overlap shouting, abrupt changes, and think about places that those things can occur. Maybe not just in the classroom, but maybe during gym, maybe at lunch or recess. Those times can be really unsettling, and fight, flight, freeze actions can be really triggering, and they may result in these actions that people may not notice on the surface level. So symptoms of trauma don't always look like misbehavior. Sometimes they look really positive. A student might be overachieving. They might be really clingy to the adults that they get to know and trust in the building. Or students could be emotionally flat, showing little to no emotion, even in very upsetting situations. And just like a youth's refugee or immigration experience, it's the same for trauma in adolescence, to where every person is going to be unique. It's impossible to predict what topics or subjects will trigger or be challenging for these newcomers. But if we learn about the signs, then you can better recognize them when you see them and support your student in a culturally appropriate and in a therapeutic way. If you're interested in some more resources about trauma responses in children, SOS Children's Village has a great resource, and so does the National Child Trauma Stress Network. So remember, all behaviors have an underlying reason, and these behaviors are not a personal attempt to make things more difficult. So what can be helpful for adolescents who have experienced trauma? I won't go through the whole list, but just a few include inclusion with others in social settings. So how can you include the student when people are chatting in their homeroom? How can you help navigate the lunchroom for this student? Can they sit next to certain people at lunch? Maybe you create some type of buddy system where a fellow classmate helps them navigate the school campus, and maybe they can sit with them in the lunchroom. Visuals are always great, especially when a student's English language is still limited. And as a teacher specifically, you know how consistency and predictability is great for developing routine. So be patient and empathetic with your student, but know that having a set routine for them will help them adjust much easier. It's also great to have safe spaces, and that means different environments where the student can remove themselves if they're feeling overwhelmed by all the stimulus. They could also be them giving you a nonverbal signal that it's too much for them, too much stimuli, and they need to remove themselves from the situation. Now, there are many challenges that refugee youth and families face in the adjustment process coming from their home country to the United States. Here are just a few that we'll discuss today. There are differences in school systems, and of course, learning English can be very difficult and overwhelming. Some students experience bullying, teasing, discrimination, and loneliness. They have to learn new social rules and dynamics. They also have to navigate their identity and expectations at home versus at school, which could look a lot different. Think back to the cultural iceberg. Some people's identities culturally are going to look different at home versus at school. One that I really want to emphasize is a difference in ethnic group relations. So majority and minority ethnic groups in a home country, in a student's home country, are now being lumped together as indistinguishable in the US context. We often see this, and it's typically unintentional, but a teacher may match up two people from the same country to be a buddy or to have a support group with one another, not realizing that those two individuals lived extremely different lives back at their home country. And it's important to understand that and recognize that. Academic misplacement is also quite common. This means a student may be assigned to a classroom that's either too challenging or not challenging enough. Typically, if a student can't speak English, sometimes people disregard them as not being intelligent. So never misinterpret a child's performance as a reflection of their academic ability. It may just be part of the language barrier. Although there are many challenges to adjustment, refugee youth and their families bring many strengths. First off, they're extremely resilient, and even in their journey to get to the United States, they value education, and there's a big emphasis on education. Learning skills such as advocacy, perseverance, and adapting to new environments. That's what they had to do to get to the United States. One big strength, and this could be for the overall classroom community and your school community, is that refugee youth and families bring diverse cultural perspectives to a classroom space. Refugee youth and families are able to code switch and navigate different cultures, and they find support and resources when they need them within their refugee communities. And again, for more information, you can look up these two great resources that can provide a more detailed explanation of some of the strengths and challenges for refugee youth and families in schools. So now we're going to talk about communication strategies when working with interpreters. We will touch on what to do without interpreters, but if you are grateful or not grateful, if you are lucky enough to be able to have interpreters in your classroom on your school campus, then here's some great tips. If you're able to, it's great to brief the interpreter prior to the conversation. So the basic who, what, when, where, why of the conversation. And if you're going to be asking or discussing sensitive topics, it's good for the interpreter to know that beforehand so they can emotionally prepare as well. Ask the interpreter not to change or alter any part of the conversation. You really want to understand word for word what the student is feeling and how they're navigating. Most interpreters will use the type of interpretation called consecutive interpreting. So this means that if you were the speaker, you would stop every 1 to 5 minutes, usually at the end of every paragraph or complete thought, and then allow time for the interpreter to step in and translate. And always allow for one person to speak at a time, as you would in any other conversation. So a few more tips. Consider cultural factors when conversing through an interpreter. If you're conversing in person, adjust your body language and speech so that you are directly speaking to the non-English speaker and not to the interpreter. So we have two examples here. In the orange would be maybe something to avoid, and in the green would be a way to change that. So you're directing your speech to the non-English speaker. So for example, instead of saying, "Is the student feeling okay?" you could look at the student and say, "Are you feeling okay?" and then pause and wait for interpretation. Instead of saying, "Can you ask the student if they need help from me?" look to the student and say, "Do you need help from me?" and then pause and wait for the interpretation. Always speak clearly and in a normal tone, meaning avoid using metaphors, acronyms, idioms, or slang, because things may be misinterpreted during translation. And collaborate with the interpreter and treat them as a professional. Try to check in with the interpreter after the conversation. How did that go for them? How were they feeling? Was anything missed in translation? Unfortunately, interpreters are sometimes looked at as a tool and not as a human with a great resource. So check in with the interpreter and see how they're feeling after the conversation. Now, I know that not always resources are provided. So what can we do when you're working without interpreters? Get creative. If available, incorporate visual models, language technology, or audio resources. Maybe a family friend or community member could be used as a resource when you can't get a hold of a formal interpreter. Really try to refrain from having another child act as an interpreter or another student. A student's main role should be a student, and they should not be used for interpretation services. And do not forget about the importance of nonverbal communication. A lot can be said without actually being said, and this goes both ways. So read the student's body language and facial expressions, and be mindful of your own, because they're reading and perceiving your body language and facial expressions as well. Always try to have a positive attitude, give compliments, encourage group work. Try to avoid overcorrecting the student. They are trying their best and are bound to make mistakes in a new language. Remain kind and patient. It's really scary and confusing when someone is speaking to us in a language we don't understand. And just because a student doesn't understand doesn't mean they are not smart. It's a reflection of the language barrier, not of their intellectual capabilities. And with all that being said, yes, we recognize it can be very frustrating if a student doesn't understand what you're trying to communicate. But a child, especially one who has experienced trauma, will learn better and will adjust quicker if they feel safe and welcomed in a classroom and they feel like they can make mistakes without punishment. Next, we're going to talk about communication strategies and how it relates to cultural humility. Culturally specific behaviors and cultural norms show up in verbal and nonverbal communication. Behavior is often informed by the relationship between the two parties, as defined by power, age, and gender. So remember that communication in one culture can be interpreted as disrespectful or inappropriate in another. The most common example that's typically used is eye contact. So in the West, maintaining eye contact signals confidence and respect. But in some parts of Asia and the Middle East, maintaining eye contact can be seen as rude or challenging during a discussion. Some other things to consider would be touch, physical distance, facial expressions, posture, gestures. And it's important to look up and educate yourself on how these things are perceived and the communication strategies of your students' culture. So for example, high context cultures rely more on nonverbal communication. They use personal relationships, social hierarchies, and cultural knowledge to convey meaning. Whereas low context cultures, the words are more important. Communication is direct. Relationships begin and end quickly, and hierarchies are relaxed. Although we have provided some examples, these may not be applicable to everyone from the same culture. Families may be different. However, learning about cultural communication styles is an opportunity to lean into practicing cultural humility. It's okay if you make a mistake, just address it and maybe ask the student how that is perceived in their culture. And here's another great resource if you're looking for cultural differences in nonverbal communication. Now, the school environment can be a great place to aid in adjustment for the student and their family. As far as feelings of safety, try to establish community for the student. Friends, trusting adults, that buddy system. Maybe encourage them to join a sports team or a club before or after school, where they can meet friends that share similar passions and interests. In terms of feeling competent and independent, it's important for students to understand school systems and structures. So although it may be tedious, it's important to explain fire drills, lockdown drills, accessing lockers, and classroom behavior expectations. Little things like accessing your locker can give a student a lot of confidence and autonomy and feelings of security. Check in on individual students and see how they might need additional support. You may see students really thriving, and then they start going backwards, and that's really normal. So check in with them often. So for teachers, creating a classroom that's welcoming. If you have the chance and you know that a newcomer will be arriving to your classroom at least a day or two before, it's really important to communicate with your class before the arrival of that student, maybe just with that classroom or that homeroom. You can prepare other students and encourage them to help that new student adjust. It's important to inform all staff members of new students and any possible language barriers. That way, a student is not misunderstood as being disobedient if they're not listening to a security guard, let's say, who is speaking English to them and doesn't realize that that student doesn't understand. Create support groups for newcomers. Encourage integration of the new student into the classroom community. Maybe you can ask the student to volunteer to I'm sorry. So an example would be to ask a volunteer to show the student around the school and guide them in navigating their classes and school structures. Another way, if the student feels comfortable, maybe you can bring in a food from their culture and everyone can taste it and learn something new about that student's culture. It's important to make note of holidays and celebrations within one's culture. This not only will help you as a teacher, but it'll help you better understand their family dynamics. For example, during Ramadan, students may be in and out of the classroom for the whole month. They also may be fasting. They may be navigating how to be hungry while they're in school trying to learn. But if you know that ahead of time, you can work with that student and help them navigate those new experiences. And try to create a diverse classroom library that represents all students. So in this video, we'll watch some extra tips for welcoming newcomers.
One way to create a warm and welcoming environment for ELL students is to make sure that you have materials in their language if possible. Within my classroom library, I try to have books in Spanish, in Hmong. I've got a couple in Somali, try to have as many languages that I can to represent what my students do. Another way is to just learn a couple of phrases in their language. For example, I know how to say, I don't know in 5 languages. And when the kids tell me, teacher, I don't know, I can spit back at them in their language and they love it. And it just shows that you care. Or even just a greeting, to be able to, when the kids come in, to say good morning in their language, it just puts them immediately at ease. And it also works really well for working with parents. At conference time, when a parent walks in and you can say hello to them in their native language, it really helps build that relationship because it lets them know that you care. Another important thing to create the welcoming environment is to understand that your students are still smart. They just don't have the English. And so to be really respectful of the intelligence that they do have and be patient with the language acquisition process. Speak slowly and honor the knowledge that they do have, even if it's not the knowledge that they necessarily need for school. One thing that I find also is extremely important in creating that welcoming environment is to know how to pronounce and how to say all of my students' names. That first day, I ask my students to say their names and I repeat it back to them as many times as I need to ensure that I have the correct pronunciation of their names. There's so many students that it just drives me crazy when they come in and say, well, my name is Umulker, but you can call me Sally. And I know that some teacher must have said to her, Umulker is too hard to say, or they got sick of adults or people not able to pronounce her name, so they pick an American name. if a child asks to be called that, you want to be respectful, but you also want to be respectful of their given names and try to learn how to pronounce their names and use their names. Throughout the year, I get new students, and it's important to make those new students feel as welcome as you can in the classroom. Usually I'm given about 1 or 2 days notice that a student will come, and I will first prepare the class. We'll tell the class that a new student will be coming in, and if we have a student who speaks the new student's language, I will tell them, for example, Jesus, we're having a new student coming in who speaks Spanish, and I will ask the student to be his buddy for the day or for the weeks to come. I will have Jesus first show the new student how to use his locker. The locker is a big anxiety level for middle school students. And I'll talk to the class about ways we can make new students feel welcome, showing them where their classes are, showing them the routines in the classroom, when to open their books, when to take out their notebooks, what the homework processes are. And we'll also talk about things like when they're in the cafeteria, how can they make someone feel welcome by asking them to sit at their table. Also, it's important to understand that a new student will probably come to you, I call it deer in the headlights. They're so nervous and they're so scared, and their eyes are just looking at you like, please don't ask me to talk. Please don't ask me to do anything. And just know that they're going to be nervous, and just try to make them feel as comfortable as you can. And giving them that buddy that speaks their language is so important. Know that they're not only dealing with a new school, they're probably dealing with a new country, a new climate, a new culture, being in a new house. A lot of my students, some of their families are still in their old country, or a lot of my students also are refugees and have seen traumas of war. So there could be a lot of issues going on. It's also important to try to connect with the family as soon as possible so that you can get some of that background knowledge to know if they've had school, if they haven't had school, if they were in war, if they weren't in war. It's important to know those things to help you make the student feel comfortable and welcomed in your class. One way to create
One great resource, and it's free, is the Culturally Responsive Teaching Checklist. So this can be found and downloaded at reimaginingmigration.org. The full link is provided at the bottom right, but it first gives you just some questions to consider about students' identities, and it helps you practice cultural humility in how do you see students from a certain culture. Do you view them through a deficit lens or a strengths-based lens? The checklist also provides different levels to how culturally responsive your teaching is or your classroom environment. So all of these are found for free on reimaginingmigration.org/culturally responsive teaching checklist. Now, I quickly want to talk about tips for all staff members, not just for teachers. So cultural humility training should be provided for all staff. Students interact with everyone, not just teachers. So it's important for all staff members, including lunchroom workers, including security, maybe custodial staff. It's important that they all are aware of who the non-English speakers are. And utilize existing resources. Ask your staff how many languages are present and how many they can speak. Maybe someone who is bilingual or trilingual can be able to connect with the student if they share a common language. Stay educated and stay engaged. Do your part and learn about important cultural holidays and celebrate them with students. And stay engaged. We touched on this earlier, but know who the newcomers are, not just those that are in your classroom or in your grade level. Encourage community. So take notice of the social dynamics in your classroom and if the new student is integrating into the social community. Stay curious and open to learning and practice that cultural humility. Ask the student how staff can make them feel more comfortable and more welcome, and check in with them throughout the year. And do not be embarrassed to make mistakes or afraid to make mistakes. To practice cultural humility means to accept that you do not know everything about a student's culture, but they can help you learn. Now, just some final takeaways before we wrap up today's presentation. Approach this work with humility and curiosity. There's so much to learn from each student. Educate yourself about the cultures of your students and the places from which they came. Ask yourself, why did they come? And maybe look into the country's history and origin stories. Be proactive. Set up a welcoming classroom environment to the student before they arrive, and prep their classmates in their homeroom if you are able to. Remember that trauma looks different for each individual. What might be triggering to one person may not be triggering to another. Trauma responses can look like misbehavior. A child who has experienced trauma needs support and reassurance, not punishment. But be mindful that trauma responses can also look positive, like overachieving. So you still want to check in with the child, even if they are academically performing well. When working with an interpreter, always speak to the child and be aware of your nonverbal communication, your body language and visuals when you don't have an interpreter. Encourage community. Try to help the student find a support group or that buddy system to help them navigate the school campus. And as always, be kind, patient, and empathetic. This is a scary transition for a lot of students, but ensuring that they feel safe and secure in a new environment is the first step in their journey to thrive. I want to take a moment now to thank you all for listening to today's presentation. I hope that you are able to, or will be able to, incorporate some of these tips moving forward. And I want to thank you to your service for and your commitment to the students and their education. Thank you so much.